way if that works for you.
Okay, how do I pull up my screen, my presentation screen?
Carrie or Dee Dee, y'all might have to help her with that.
You should
Push
see
the share button.
Yeah, you should see a button at the bottom that says share. Let me make you a presenter. You should see a button at the bottom that says share, and then you can share your PowerPoint.
Okay, share. Okay, so now here we go. All right, there it is.
Awesome.
Let's
see. Yes.
All right. Got all these little pop-ups. Okay. All right. I'm ready.
Okay, good. All right, so everybody, this is Sharon Morgan. She is a native of Chicago. She's a writer and genealogist. She's a descendant of ancestors in Noxubee County, Mississippi. Sharon is the co-author with Thomas DeWolf of Gather at the Table, The Healing Journey of a Daughter of Slavery and a Son of the Slave Trade, as well as Finding Your Family Tree, a beginner's guide to researching your genealogy. She lives in Macon, Mississippi, where she's writing a book about her ancestral heritage. She is the founder of OurBlackAncestry.com, a website devoted to African American genealogy. She serves on the board of the Noxubee County Historical Society, and she is a daughter of the American Revolution. In 2022, she was awarded Woman of the Year by the Noxubee Alliance. Prior to retirement, she was the multicultural marketing expert who worked for many years as a consultant to Fortune 100 companies, including Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and Walmart. So she has worn many hats over the years, and we're very excited to have her with us today. Once she's done with her talk, we'll have time for discussion and questions and stuff. So if y'all just hold off on those. And Sharon, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Let's see. How do I flip my slides? Gotcha. Okay, so today we're going to talk about healing historical harm. And the icon that you see on this front page is called a Sankofa. It is an African symbol that tells us to go back and get it. So you will understand the meaning of that as we go on with the presentation. This is a little bit more about me. That picture of me is me in better days without having a bad hair day with this turban on. As Miranda has said, I'm the founder of Our Black Ancestry. We have a website that is devoted to African American genealogical research. And we have a Facebook page that is a peer research community that has more than 36,000 members. Across the bottom are books that I have written or been involved with. Gather at the Table is probably the most important, and we'll talk about that a lot as we go on. I've also been a contributor to the Little Book of Racial Healing, to a book next entitled Slavery's Descendants. And in March of this year, Finding Your Family Tree was released. So I'm really proud of having been so productive living in Mississippi. It is like this has really encouraged my creativity. So the topic for today is healing historical harm. So to begin that discussion, we have to talk about the American legacy. America the Beautiful has a very great history of legacy of historical harm. The very foundations of the country were built upon the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement of Africans. How do we overcome that history and empower our future as a society that truly embraces the ideals of the Declaration of Independence? Thomas Jefferson, who was the writer of that declaration, said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." As American society has evolved, we also know that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, women, and everybody are created equal. So that definition has definitely grown and really needs to keep growing. So America's original sins, and that is not, I put it in quotes because it's not meant to be a church statement, but that's the best word that I could find. So they are 400 years of Native American genocide and 245 years of African slavery. I really like to use pictures because they make it more visual so you can see what happened. So the picture on the left is the Trail of Tears. The picture on the right is an enslaved community actually in South Carolina. What is historical harm? It is multi-generational trauma that is experienced by cultural, racial, or ethnic groups. It's related to major events that oppress people because of their status as oppressed. There was the forced migration of Africans and the ensuing slavery in America, and the violent eradication and colonization of Native Americans. While many experience no effects, others may experience damaged cultural identity, and that will become very obvious as we continue talking. Poor physical and behavioral health, low self-esteem, depression, self-destructive behavior, a marked propensity for violent or aggressive behavior, substance misuse and addiction, and high rates of suicide and cardiovascular disease. And there are also acute problems of domestic violence. So the picture of the flag is meant to represent how broken our society is, and we're going to talk about how we can fix that. And I don't have all the answers. I'm just going to tell you what happened with me. So this is my family story of historical harm. Genealogy, which I have committed my entire life to, is what led me to healing. When my son was born in 1969, that was the impetus for why I started doing genealogical research. And I started before there was an internet. So all of this stuff had to be done manually and was incredibly arduous. It is a lot better now because we have so many things that are online. So my research really got propelled when the internet came. And I have constructed an amazing accumulation of data about my family. But when he was, one of the first things that I learned was that my great-grandparents on both sides of my family were enslaved. And I had a great-grandmother who was actually alive when I was a small child. I was 4 when she died, so I really couldn't have conversations with her. But I do have a very vivid memory of what she looked like. And when I heard her story, it was appalling, fascinating, and it really made me want to go on. So I spent a lifetime researching my roots. Across the bottom is my family, and I do this for my family. I have 1 son, 2 grandkids. So you see my handsome son and his beautiful wife on the left. In the middle are they and me and my grandkids, who are now much bigger than that. And on the right is a picture of my son who actually ran for Congress in 2010 in New York. So the stories of our lives continue, and I am really proud to be able to share this with my son and my grandkids and everybody else in the world. So my inherited trauma. Kidnapping, ancestors that were kidnapped in Africa and brought to America. Their enslavement here. Rape. I have at least 2 instances of that. One of them is a great-grandmother, and the other is my enslaved ancestress who had many children with the nephew of her owner. And I cannot exactly call that rape, but she did not have agency, so she couldn't consent to her relationship with him. So I kind of included under that topic. Miscegenation, my family is very mixed. You can tell by my complexion that I am mixed with Black and white people. And in the old days, it was called miscegenation, and it was illegal. Sharecropping, Jim Crow, segregation, lynching. My grandfather's uncle was lynched here in Mississippi. The Great Migration is what drove them out of Mississippi and onward to Chicago, where I was born. Disenfranchisement, the ability to vote, and then that being taken away. Discrimination. Well, on that note, on voting, Dee Dee has done some really incredible work on identifying Black legislators in Mississippi. So I urge you to look at her work because it is really significant. Discrimination and colorism, even in the Black community, there are problems with people identifying because of complexion. When I moved here to Macon, it was really interesting that somebody called me out in my car one day and asked me if I was Black or white. And I had never had that question asked of me before. Many of these things are discussed in this book on the right, which was written by someone that I know really well, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. And when we just talked about historical harm, that's what we're talking about, is the things that we have inherited generationally because of slavery. So, the culmination of my genealogical research and everything that I've done is that I came here to claim my roots. Welcome to Mississippi. It's like coming home, and I do feel at home, and I've been able to tremendously forward all of my work by living here. This is my family tree. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail. You'll see a little bit more later. But if you are doing genealogical research, you will build a tree like this. So I've included all the generations that I can, well, not all, but at least 4 generations of people that I am descended from, beginning with me and ending with my cat. So I have my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, and there are much more, but this is just a vivid example of what it looks like when you do a tree. My enslaved ancestors, I found in constructing that tree more than a dozen people on both sides who were enslaved people. I have listed the names that I know on the right. There are many more because one of the problems with enslavement was that people, their families were broken. So I don't know everybody I'm related to, and I still don't know. And why do people always decide to call you when you're on a Zoom call? Go away. Okay. So I'm still working on that, and we will see how it turns out. On my father's side, my family name is Leslie. So Tom Leslie and Rhoda Reeves were born into slavery around 1850. When they were emancipated, Tom, Rhoda, and her mother, Easter, departed a plantation at Lowndes County, Alabama. Lowndes County is one of the poorest counties still in Alabama. They moved to Opelika, where they married in 1871 and started a family. And by 1890, they were living in Montgomery, where my father was born in 1914. So that is Tom and Rhoda on the left. And then their son, Robert Leslie, who was my grandfather, his wife, Julia Williams, and the little boys on the horse are my father and his 2 brothers. My maternal side, my mother's side, is Gavin and Nicholson. So Betty Wharf, and you see her picture to the right, was born into slavery around 1840. She was purchased by John Wharf as a 9-year-old child and transported to Mississippi. Imagine if you have children or grandchildren, a 9-year-old one of them being taken away from you, never to see you again. Betty was enslaved by Allen Gavin at Noxubee, Mississippi. She was sold, Wharf sold her. She bore 17 children with Allen Gavin's nephew, Robert Gavin, who's pictured on the right. Her daughter, Ella, the picture's running down the bottom, married Wash Nicholson in 1885 and had 6 children. One of them was Lewis Nicholson, the next one on the right, who was born in 1895. He's my grandfather, and he was born at Noxubee. During the Great Migration, they and others migrated to Chicago. And my mother, the last picture of the little girl with the ball in her hand, was born in 1929 in Chicago. In doing the research to fill out that picture, I'm going to give you some examples of some documents that I have found. 1790 was the first census taken by the federal government, and it's required to be taken every 10 years. In 1790, only white people were documented, although slaves were counted. So you can track from 1790 who owned slaves and how many. 1870 was the first census that documented African Americans as people, as human beings with surnames, and many did not take the name of the slaveholder. By 1880, many African Americans had moved and changed their names. Many of them did not participate in the census, either because of rural locations where the census taker just couldn't get there, or a fear of being identified. On the right, you see the 1870 census where I found Betty, who was enslaved as the 9-year-old child, and her family, and they're living next door to Robert Gavin, who ended up being who is the father of all those children on her list. For slaveholders, there are slave schedules in the census, even though slaves were counted, as I said, from 1790 but not named. In 1850 and 1860, there were separate schedules. These are really useful to African American researchers and others who want to know the scope of ancestral slave holdings. So on the right, this is a slave schedule for John Edward Gavin, who was the original Gavin in Noxubee County. And so this is a partial list of his enslaved people. And their family, he and his brothers, collectively owned 183 people in 1860. So there are several of these schedules that apply to that family. In order to find the enslaved person, you look at the 1870 census and you compare it to 1880, which I just showed you with Betty. So you get to see that in 1870, her name is Betty Wharf, and she has several children, and she is a farmhand. And she's living next door to the white Gavin family who owned her. In 1880, she is now Betty Gavin and has more children, and it helps you to build out your tree. As you go with each census, you'll get more names and you'll be able to connect more relationships. So finding the slaveholder is similar. You find them in 1870, and when you find likely prospects, you search them to prove a connection between the slaveholder and the enslaved person. So you look for wills, deeds, court cases, insurance records, whatever. There is something that is called the Nettie rule, where when you look in the census in, say, 1870, you search 10 households forward and 10 households backward, and you're likely to find the slaveholder and descendants of enslaved people. If you find people who have the same name, if I look at John Gavin on the federal census, not the slave schedule, then I've seen many, 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 many Gavins. So if they enslaved 183 people, you'll find a lot of people with the Gavin name, and that will help you. And then you want to find the actual descendants who are alive. So you choose a start person and you search names on the census through 1840. So starting in 1870, you track those people forward to present times. And then you look for recent documents, and then you locate informants. So you will see on a recent document, a marriage record or whatever. So you want to locate who is that record for, are they still alive, and can you get information on how to contact them? And then you prowl and post on social media. So across the bottom are all people that I have found and met in person who are descendants of Gavin. And they live everywhere: Virginia, Arizona, Illinois, Florida. It is amazing how widespread they are. And you will see two men close to the right who had no idea that they had Black ancestry. And we have been collaborating And they found that out, and they found out that their family had come from Mississippi. So there's been a lot of learning in this process. You could also do DNA testing, which has revealed a lot of things that people may not want to know, like with the people that I just mentioned. But it proves beyond doubt who you're related to and where your family originated. So for Betty Wharf Gavin, her mother apparently came from East Africa, and it would have been the Makua tribe of people. For Nicholson, my grandfather's father, his ancestors were Mandinka, and they came from West Africa. And the fathers, the white fathers, were all Scotsmen who came from Scotland. And they actually thought they were Irish. So we have now been able to provide them with information about kilts and Scottish traditions that they didn't expect to have. As you consider doing DNA, you need to think about this science that is still evolving, but it's related to epigenetics. And it says that our experiences and those of our forebears are never gone, even if they have been forgotten. Traumatic experiences leave molecular scars, and this applies to people whose ancestors experienced seriously traumatic events. Africans who survived slavery, Jews who endured the Holocaust, Chinese people whose grandparents experienced the Cultural Revolution. But one thing you need to know is that even if you inherit these genes, they can also change back. So our history is not our destiny. You want to encode something for future generations that is different so that the trauma is transformed. So I'm going to give you a little bit more historical perspective. So we'll start with Native American conquest. Prior to the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Americas in 1492, there were thriving indigenous populations that totaled more than 60 million people. Over the following century, that number dropped to 6 million. That means 90% of the entire Native American community was wiped out. One huge event that happened in the course of that unfolding was the Dancing Rabbit Creek Treaty. It was signed between the U.S. government and the Choctaw tribe in 1830, proclaimed in 1831, and it was signed where I live in Noxubee County, Mississippi. It was the first removal treaty that was implemented under the Federal Indian Removal Act, and it ceded 11 million acres of the Choctaw Nation in what is now Mississippi, in exchange for 15 million acres in Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. Native American conquest enabled European settlers to claim as their own the entire land that is now the United States. The Choctaw was not the only Native American tribe. There were many, many, many of them in many communities. This one is just particularly significant because of this treaty. For African Americans, there's the transatlantic slave trade, which endured for 4 centuries. 12 million people were stolen from Africa. 3 million perished in the Middle Passage, which was the trip on boats from Africa to America, and countless more died in wars and raids that were connected to the trade. The map that you see on the right is a map of the slave trade, and you get an idea of how many people were taken from each place. The triangular trade connected the economies of 4 continents, Europe, Africa, North and South America, and all of the islands in between. And the slave trade built the economy of the entire Western world. This is truly a global situation. It's not just America. So the enslavement of African people, this was kind of shocking. Out of 12 million people who were kidnapped, only 500,000 Middle Passage survivors were enslaved in America, in North America. In 1865, that 500,000 people had turned into 4 million people who were emancipated by the Civil War. In 1865, also, only 250,000 people were free. And today we are a population of 46 million people. So our population has grown exponentially over the centuries. I have to speak through an African American lens because that is who I am. So I'm not going to talk a lot more from this point forward about Native American history. It's going to be very much related to African American. So slavery was described as the peculiar institution because slavery in America was very different from how it was practiced in other places. So slaves were defined as chattel. They were property, not human beings. They were held against their will from the time of their capture, purchase, or birth, and deprived of the right to leave, refuse to work, or to receive any compensation for their labor. Enslavement was permanent, and it was generational. Children were enslaved based on the status of their mother, and the European standard was very different. European families tracked down from their patriarch, who was a white man, and for enslaved people, that is not true. It went through the mother. Slavery dehumanized an entire race of people based on the color of their skin. So it was the peculiarity was that being property, it being permanent and generational, and for it to affect the entire race of people. The enslavers were the people who founded America. So 49% of the 55 delegates to the Constitutional Convention owned slaves. 12 of the first 18 American presidents owned slaves. And in 1860, 394,000 people held 4 million people in bondage. 1 in 70 people were slaveholders, and they had an average slaveholding of 10 people. Owners of 200 or more slaves were less than 1% of the total, but held 20 to 30% of all slaves. So America has always had a 1%, and it started here. Over 80% of free adult males in the South did not own slaves, and that was also another interesting fact. So you had very large plantations, and then you had smaller ones. So kind of a benchmark is that if someone only owned enough land to be farmed by a family, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 acres, then they probably didn't own slaves. Where you find the huge tracts of land, a plantation was defined as 1,000 acres or more, and those are the ones where you find the most enslaved people. And most slaveholders were Scots-Irish. There was a second wave after the transatlantic slave trade, a domestic slave trade. When America outlawed the importation of people from Africa, it then became necessary, since you could not bring people, you couldn't import people from outside, you had to capitalize on what you already had. So this is when you had a lot of breeding and people who were actually African descended people who were actually born here. So the domestic slave trade, another 1.2 million enslaved people were displaced from Atlantic states to the deep South because of the westward expansion of the country and explosion of cash as a cotton crop. Richmond, Virginia was the center of the domestic slave trade, and that from 1830 to 1860. And a major slave trading place was the Forks of the Road in Natchez, Mississippi. What happened is that people who were kidnapped and brought over during the transatlantic slave trade, most of them came through Charleston. The domestic slave trade then switched over to Richmond. Subsequent to slavery, there was Reconstruction, and I should also mention that it took 3 constitutional amendments in order for people to really become free. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments are really significant to this. And that leads us to Reconstruction from 1865 to 1877. And it was the federal government's attempt to recover from the Civil War. They established something called the Freedmen's Bureau, and schools like Tuskegee Institute were created. Black people were allowed to vote. They were successfully elected to political offices throughout the South, and there was serious discussion about reparations. Then there was sharecropping. What happened is that after the Civil War, The Freedmen's Bureau could only do so much, but what they did do was people could contract with the person who had previously owned them, and they could sharecrop land on the same place where they had been enslaved, but now they would be paid in some way. So they were no longer free workers, but the sharecropping system was very punitive. Former slaves worked for subsistence wages on the same land for the same masters who had enslaved them. They would get living quarters, supplies. They raised crops, usually cotton, and gave half to their landlord. But it was a new form of economic dependence and poverty. So slavery didn't really end. Slavery just transmuted into something else. Then there was Jim Crow. For 100 years, racial segregation laws circumscribed the lives and ambitions of African Americans. And there we get the examples of segregated spaces, whites only water fountains, the Ku Klux Klan, and then leading to the need for a civil rights movement, which you see at the bottom picture on the right, where dogs are attacking human beings. Peonage was another form. So we have sharecropping. Then we have from 1877 to 1940, Black men, women, and children became victims of debt slavery. What would happen is that you could be arrested for being a vagrant if you couldn't prove you had a job, and you'd have to pay a fine. Of course, you didn't have the money to pay the fine, so they put you in jail so you work off your fine, but you probably would never work it off. So the book on the right, Slavery by Another Name, documents this. And Douglas Blackman, the author, there is a set of records at the Department of Justice that has 600,000 names of people who were enslaved in the system. It's also important to know that peonage still exists in that slavery is still legal for people who are incarcerated. So when you see the workers around Mississippi, like in Noxubee County, wearing the green and white striped uniforms, they are working basically for free. They may get a small little pittance, but it is legal for them to be enslaved, and that was shocking to me. Strange fruit. This is about lynching. So from 1882 to 1968, 4,700 men, women, and children were lynched. 3,437 were Black people, and 1,293 were white people. So that was another thing that was really interesting to me. The highest number of lynchings occurred in Mississippi, where there were 581. There was an anti-lynching crusade that was led by African American organizations from the 1890s to the 1930s. And there have been several instances documented in 1988 and even beyond. If you're interested in looking more into this, go to the website for the Equal Justice Initiative, and there's an extensive listing of all the names of people and their lynching memorial that they have in Montgomery, Alabama, which is awesome to visit. The Great Migration. After all of this terror, the sharecropping, the lynching, the Ku Klux Klan, everything, 7+ million African Americans migrated out of the South. The South used to be primarily Black population. Great Migration changed that paradigm so that Mississippi became a predominantly white state. African Americans left and went north, Midwest, and west. That's how my family ended up in Chicago. So from 1916 to 1930, that was the 7 million. Then there was a second migration from 1940 to 1970, and another 1.6 million people changed location from north to south. That had a lot to do with the war because there were job openings, so people were able to find employment in the north that was not sharecropping, and they were able to change their lives and seek economic improvement. There is a reverse migration in progress, leading with Sharon Morgan, where more than 300,000 Black people moved south from 2005 to 2010. I don't know a current statistic, but I know there are many more because I have a lot of friends who are coming here. The global consequences of all of this is that Africa was depopulated. Without slavery, their 1850 population would have doubled. 18 to 40-year-old able-bodied people were impaired the ability to thrive economically, socially, and culturally. So today, the poorest countries in Africa are those from which the most slaves were taken. In Europe and in the Americas, contemporary economic wealth, generational wealth, is tangible evidence of economies that were built on slavery. The elephant in the room is that belief in European superiority fueled genocide and slavery and engendered a pernicious system that continues to enthrall. So racism is the final issue that we get to after all of this history, and this is what I am using my genealogy to try to address. We have systemic inequity. There are disparities in every key indicator of social well-being: economics, health, education, violence, incarceration. The differences are astonishing. When you look at lifespan, Black people have a lifespan that is 5 years different from that of white people. And that's just one big one. And I won't go into the details of the others, but that's the biggest one to know. And then we have this wave of division, hate, and violence. And many of it is 59% is directed against people because of their race or ethnicity. 18% of it is directed against people for religious reasons. 16% is directed against people because of their sexual orientation. The most horrendous one of these for me was when Dylan Roof attacked a church in South Carolina, and he went and prayed with those people, and then he turned around and systematically killed them. And that was like the height of how hateful can you get? And his belief was making white America white again. And I'm not going to get into a political discussion, but our last president helped to fuel a lot of this. How did this happen? One big thing to think about is something called cognitive dissonance. When Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he was a slaveholder, and he ended up having children with his wife's half-sister. And they produced descendants who are still living today. And that is a friend of mine on the bottom right, who is one of those descendants. But it took cognitive dissonance, comforting lies versus unpleasant truths. So Jefferson had to have something in his head and the other founding fathers. It is fine for us to create a country that only supports rich white men, and it is okay to enslave people. So as we are talking about freedom and democracy for us, we are enslaving people. How do you match those two divergent ideas in your head? That's cognitive dissonance. Complicity. Slavery was the primary driver of American economic development and the primary source of American wealth. And the book, The Half Has Never Been Told, is really useful for reading about that. It talks about slavery and the making of American capitalism. So that's one big thing. The other is that all of America, North and South, was complicit in building and sharing wealth generated by slavery. Everybody puts it on the South, but the North was very much involved. You may have enslaved people in Mississippi, but that cotton went north to be processed and to be sold. So the book on the right, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery, is really interesting to read because they try to make us the poster child for what happened, and it really did involve everybody. The people in Rhode Island built the slave ships. What this has led to is an implicit bias. what happens is that you have these biases that you don't even know that you have, that affect your understanding, actions, and decisions that are very unconscious. You are not aware of it, and you do not have intentional control. And it causes people to have feelings and attitudes about people that are based on race, ethnicity, age, appearance. They develop over the course of a lifetime. Children are not born racist. They learn that either from their parents or their community. So for Black people, what we get is black ball, black book, black boy, black eye, Black Friday, black hand, all black things culminating in little black Sambo. These are all white lies because black is beautiful. All human beings are beautiful, and we need to embrace that and embrace each other. So from trauma to transformation, that's how we do this. And I don't have all of these answers. I'm just going to tell you personally, this is how it worked for me. So my training started at Eastern Mennonite University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. They have something called the Center for Justice and Peace Building. They work with people in conflict zones around the world and are noted for that as a training space and experts in how do you resurrect people who are born into conflict. One example is that they're very supportive of truth and reconciliation commissions in various countries. So they created at CJP a program called STAR, and it is a training program that teaches you how to engage strategies for trauma awareness and resilience. They started counseling with people who were affected by 9/11, the survivor families. So they worked with them and they had a model for how do you overcome this trauma. Then that developed into something that's called Coming to the Table, where they created a model based on the work they've been doing in conflict zones for how do you overcome historical harm. So I ended up being engaged with all of these groups and ended up now I work extensively with Coming to the Table. So one key learning from this is that hurt people hurt people. So when you see this cycle of violence, and it's made like an infinity symbol, so it goes in that wavy infinity pattern. And these are all the things that happen along the way when you experience a traumatic act of violence or you commit an act of violence. Violence affects the perpetrator, the person who is inflicting the violence, the person who is being hurt by the violence, and the people who are bystanders. So hurt people hurt people. Europeans came here and they had a pretty awful life before they came here, which is why they came here. But they took the hurt that they had experienced and they inflicted it on others. So it continues on this never-ending cycle unless you make a conscious decision to get off of the cycle and do something different. That's what I tried to do. So Coming to the Table is dedicated to taking America beyond the legacy of enslavement. And this is a very short version. You can go to the website and see more. What you want to do is uncover the history. So that's what I do with my genealogical research. And one of the consequences of doing that research made me a really angry person, which is why I set out in finding these resources and doing something different, because you cannot live your life with that much anger. I wanted to channel my anger into something that was productive. So that is what I did. That is how I ended up writing my book. So once you uncover the history, then you try to make connections. So you want to connect within and across racial lines so that you develop relationships. Because what happens is that this is not something that you really get in a school course. It is basically relationships. So now I know Miranda, now I know Dee Dee, now I know this whole community of people who are dedicated to doing many things to help bring people together. So you want to work toward healing. How do you heal together? Through dialogue, reunion, ritual, whatever it is, but to be able to engage the humanity in others and to take action so that you do something in your individual area of expertise that works toward transformation. The problems are huge. We cannot solve all these problems. All we can do is work within our little sphere of influence and do the best we can, as much as we can, wherever we can. So I'm in Noxubee County, Mississippi, and that is what I'm doing here. One of the other things that we learned was about restorative justice, and it's a alternative framework for thinking about justice. The American system is built on retributive justice. So crime is a defense against the state, and it demands punishment. That's why our incarceration rates are so high. We do not compare. All the other countries in the world do not incarcerate as many people as we do for so many offenses that are so small, and they'll get life in prison. There have been people in Mississippi. There's one guy who's in prison for stealing less than $1, and he's still in jail. The alternative is restorative justice, where you think of crime as something that is a violation of people and relationships, and you need to engage both sides in figuring out what do you do. Sometimes it doesn't take punishment, it takes some other intervention. So who has been hurt? What are the causes? What are the needs of both parties? And what is the appropriate process to put things right? So when you look at historical harm and you look at building these relationships, this is the kind of relationship that you want to have there. Both sides were hurt. I had never thought about this until I got involved in these studies. But Black people who were enslaved, they were hurt. It was a crime against them. It was a crime against humanity. The slaveholder was also hurt. When you had the Civil War, the white population of the South was depopulated. And so those are mothers who lost their children. So they're also being hurt. And so you have to have a bigger picture of this. Hurt people hurt people. So my healing journey that ended up with me writing Gather at the Table is based on all of this. So my co-writer is on the right, Tom DeWolf. And one of the things that we did was that we got in a car and we made a map based on our family genealogies, and we went to all these places. We spent 30 days on the road, and we traveled 6,000 miles with my dog in the car. And we visited places that were related to our genealogy and related to just generally education or sites of historical harm. Like we went to the Emmett Till Museum in Money, Mississippi. And the idea was that his family descended from the largest slave trading family in American history. They were based in Rhode Island. My ancestors, as I told you, were from Alabama and Mississippi. And we wanted to see and we did not know each other when we started writing this book. We got involved because of coming into the table. And we wanted to see how our feelings were the same or different and what that history meant to us. And that is the book that we ended up writing, and it's still available, although it's getting kind of old now. One thing that stands out as we think about healing the historical harm are these symbols that are used, and I've only included two. One of them is the Confederate statue at Noxubee, Mississippi, and it was originally in place in 1907 in front of the courthouse that is behind it. And the people that I researched, the Gavin family, one of them is listed on that statue. And I would like to see that statue removed. I don't think all statues and all symbols need to go. I think many of them just need to be interpreted. But we really have to think about how these symbols continue to perpetuate the differences in our society and things that are flawed. So when you look at the Mississippi flag on the bottom, I was really happy, and I have one flying outside of my house because it no longer has the Confederate flag as part of it. And so I love the magnolia. And like I said, our new symbol, I can fly it proudly. I do not have to be ashamed and say, oh my God, I come from Mississippi. Okay, so we really have to think about the symbols and all the things that surround us that perpetuate the cognitive dissonance, the implicit bias. We have to create a new path with new symbols. There's also the discussion about reparations. White people are really afraid that we're going to actually ask for them to come and take out their checkbooks. And I've done presentations on this, And I have joked, it's like, okay, I am here and I want you to take out your checkbook and I want to have you sign over the mortgage to your house. And I get this reaction that is so funny because they're like, oh, and they think that I'm really telling the truth. And I'm just joking because it's like, come on, get up off of this. So the one big thing for me is that there's been a House of Representatives bill that has been presented every year since 1989. And it is to establish a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans Act. And after all of these years, more than 40 years, we still can't get that bill passed. And all it says to do is to study and develop proposals. And I really would like to see that happen. The book on the left by Randall Robinson, What America Owes to Blacks, is a really good description of what should happen for reparations. And no, most people are not asking for a personal check. They are asking for changes in society and things that will happen, support of Black education, things that help to close the wealth gap. So those are the things that we really want to have. But let's just at least study it. They study everything else. So I would really like to see that happen. So my mission in action is that I do our Black ancestry. And like I said, I now have 36,000 people, which are really hard to keep up with. Locally, I am now secretary of the board of the Noxubee County Historical Society, and I've done a huge amount to open their eyes. It was a community of old white people, and now we are getting younger people. We have Black people, and we are making it a much more inclusive group that is dedicated to preserving the past, not so that we can always look back on our glory days, but so we can empower our future. I'm also involved now as appointed to the board of Mississippi Hills National Heritage Area. So I'm really proud of my local work, and I hope that it's making a difference. So these are a lot of resources that you can use. I urge everyone to watch the movie 12 Years a Slave because it is a visceral viewing of what slavery was. And then post-traumatic slave syndrome, which I talked about, the history of white people. So all these things are useful in understanding all the different sides. So I urge you to look at those. And I'm assuming that this presentation is going to go online later, so you'll get to see it. I hope. So you'll be able to come back and refer to it. So now I'm at the end. We're at 12:55. How much time do we have to talk? And I'm willing to stay.
We have a few minutes if anyone does have any questions. We won't hold you too much longer, but yes, this presentation will go on the Society of Mississippi Archivists YouTube channel. So subscribe to that, and we'll post it on our social media and stuff as well. So if anybody has a question, you can put it in the chat, or I think you may be able to unmute yourself. I just wanted to ask really quick, Sharon, I don't know if you can talk about it or like at what point you're at this point, but you did say that you're writing a book about your ancestral heritage. Can you tell us about like when you're expecting for that to come out, or do you know?
I came here 5 years ago to write this book. And I have found so many other things one thing writers are really good at is procrastination. But this is the longest procrastination that I've had. I wrote the book, Finding Your Family Tree. Okay, so it took a long time to write that. So it's like, now I'm writing my Betty book again. So hopefully I will finish it. My goal is to finish it by the end of this year. And my goal is that it would then be published the following year. So that's what I hope.
Well, excuse me, we look forward.
Right now it's called the Betty book. It may have another title, but we will see. That's my working title.
I like it. Hey, it works.
Yeah, it does.
Someone asked, what's been the biggest challenges and blessings of doing this type of restorative work?
The challenge is people having closed minds. so they are not willing to embrace change. And so finding ways to talk to people in a way, I am not angry anymore. Well, there are some things that make me angry, but I am not I'm not aggressive like that. And I have found ways to have conversations in a better way so that they are more engaging. So it has been challenging for me personally. How do I evolve into someone who expresses herself in a way like through Gather at the Table? I talk a lot about that transformation and how you begin to see all the different sides and how you have better conversations. And so that's my personal challenge. The product of that is these closed minds. I mean, I live in a place where a lot of people here just don't want to hear it. And white people's responses are usually they feel that they are being attacked. South Carolina is banning books because the children say that it makes them feel guilty, and they're not seeing these conversations in the right way, because it is not guilt is what holds racism together. The feeling to have is not feeling guilty. The feeling should be uncovering history is just uncovering the facts. Now, what do you do with this? So it's not you didn't do it. It is an ancestral inheritance. So you need to focus not on the guilt, but on the reparation.
And also, if we want to follow your work, I know you mentioned Black Ancestry or our blackancestry.com and comingtothetable.org. But if we want to follow your work and stay in touch, how do we do that?
Our Black Ancestry is the best way. I have a Facebook page, but I think that it is loaded by now. I think I got 5,000 people there. So Our Black Ancestry is the best way. I post stuff. There is an Our Black Ancestry page on Facebook. So if you go to that page and join that page, I post frequently. And you can message if you get there, you will be able to see what I post and see what others post. And it's really active, like seriously active. Keeping up with it is very difficult, but that is the best way. So join the Our Black Ancestry Facebook page.
Awesome. Well, it's 1 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and let everybody go. But thank you again, Sharon, for talking to us. It's always a pleasure. And thank you for all the work you've done.
Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, and thanks
I will see you soon. I'll probably see you at the book festival.
Yes, absolutely. Come find me. All right. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.